Bay Area Disc's 2015 Youth Ultimate Coaching Conference.
So as Nick mentioned there, I played through all these different levels. I started playing Ultimate over 20 years ago in grade 6. I am older than I look. And it was by accident. So my journey in terms of Ultimate and athlete development was a fluke. I missed the bus because I had poor time management skills, which some of you may have kids or that you've coached who have similar time management skills as I did. But I had an hour to kill. I was waiting for my mom to pick me up, and I saw some discs flying around. So I decided to go play, go give it a shot. The next week, I missed the bus on purpose. I had a chat with my mom about it after, and that if I really wanted to play, I just had to tell her. So, we sorted that part out. But I fell in love with the game. And that game gave me a ton of opportunities. I got to play many different cities across the world. I got to go through the junior development, play the junior national team, go to club worlds, meet the women I would one day marry through the sport, and get a chance to give back and coach. But at each of those stages, that opportunity would not have been there for me without people like you, without adults who are administrators, coaches, volunteers, and parents who took the time and the effort to make sure that I had these opportunities to develop as an athlete, but more importantly, to develop as a person. So as someone who has already gone through the junior development, I want to thank everyone here for your dedication and for being involved in youth sport, because it does make a difference, and it's formative in how youth are developed. So today, I'm talking about long-term athlete development, and I'm going to be going over what it is, some of its key factors, and what Ultimate Canada is doing around it. In essence, long-term athlete development is looking at how do we get a young Cole Keffer there on the left to become a national team player here on the right. This is the same kid. So what's the pathway, and what is the optimal way to develop an athlete? All right, so in a nutshell, that's what long-term athlete development is looking at, from playground to podium. And it's looking at what's that framework for the optimal training, for competition, recovery, at different stages of development. In Canada, long-term athlete development is required for all sports to develop. Some sports have 7, that's the standard. We put in an 8th one to develop at the later stages. But it's a series of standards and recommendations on what to do at each stage. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about each stage. You can see them for free on our website. We share the information around long-term athlete development. But they are starting from active start, so 0 to 6-year-olds, moving on to fundamentals and that emphasis on fun, down to training to win, which would be our senior national teams, and ultimate for life, which I won't admit to myself, but I'm probably in right now. Playing league, coaching, and having fun, staying active in the ultimate community. All right, so why do we need these stages and these different recommendations? I'm going to start with a short video that's looking at another sport in terms of what they looked at for major changes.
Change is coming to tennis, and kids are leading the way. It's called 10 and under tennis, and it's a fun way for your kids to really learn the game. With courts and equipment modified to fit them, kids will develop faster and better, and enjoy themselves along the way. So get your kids involved now. With 10 and under tennis, every child can learn to love the game.
So the athlete development movement isn't just an ultimate. It's across sports. And in the US, organizations like US Tennis and others are working on their models. So other sports like soccer made the change years ago in terms of playing smaller-sided games, but Ultimate, as we're relatively new, don't have that same infrastructure and history. When I started playing in the early 90s, we played on a full field in elementary school. There were some really long points that I'm sure were painful for everyone involved to watch. We didn't score a lot. The points in the score totals weren't that high. Our skill development wasn't very good because it was kind of a game of a bunch of 500s where maybe if you could get 6 in a row, you would score. Maybe, if it wasn't windy out. So what a lot of long-term athlete development is looking is how do we optimize the game? This is why do we have to make these changes? We have to optimize it for these age groups. How do we make it so they can build skills in the different areas in the different ages? Because what's appropriate for someone on the senior national team is not appropriate for a 9-year-old. What's appropriate for people in different stages of development around puberty is going to change based on how old they are physically. So we have to be really aware of that in the approach of trying to build the best athlete we can and what the best path is. So these are a series of recommendations that are underlying principles that I'm going to go over next in terms of key factors that we looked at when we're designing our long-term athlete development strategy. First one is excellence takes time. So 10 years, 10,000 an hour rule. If we want to get this young child here from St. John's, Newfoundland up to the national team, they're going to have to put in a lot of time to get there. Now, one of the things for Ultimate that I think people have already seen for our players, that 10 years, that 10,000 hours, it doesn't have to be all in Ultimate. There's a lot of skills that transfer, and that's part of our strategy for years that we've been using as a sport. College recruitment. Hey, you played basketball. Hey, you played soccer. Come play Ultimate. You'll probably transfer really well. Can you run? Can you jump? Great, we'll teach you how to throw and catch. So that last part of some of that, the field knowledge and the technical skills is part of what our strategy has been for this excellence takes time, is we can get athletes to cross over. We can then figure out what are these Ultimate specific skills that we need to teach them to make sure that they can go into that path of excellence. Because to be honest, a lot of the sports do a great job of teaching speed, of teaching agility, of teaching teamwork, and certain aspects of field sense that can transfer over quite well to Ultimate. The second area in our plan is around fundamentals and physical literacy. I was chatting with a gentleman earlier today, I think he was talking, it was Cliff, that we were talking about some of his students that he had who were very concerned about studying, and that Ultimate came after because it was cultural, I believe, as well as, in terms of them wanting to make sure they could get into good colleges. But the thing is with kids, while you want them to be literate so they can go to university and read and go further, if they're not physically literate, they're not going to be able to go further in terms of sports and activities. So this is an area that is also important that we are, as a community in Canada across the sports world, really trying to emphasize. That we need fundamental movement skills and sport-specific ones, so fundamental sports skills. But they can be trained separately, like we were talking about for excellence. And for physical literacy, generally, you're going to do best before age 11 or 12 to have those skills, to be able to run, to jump, to throw. And if you can start teaching skills like throwing and catching before that critical window, you're going to have a higher potential for those athletes to be able to learn. Now, we're not the only sport that looks at this from crossing over. In Canada, hockey is the big sport. I'm sure you all know Canadians are crazy about hockey. Women's hockey, they love getting players from ringette because they think they teach them how to skate better than they do in the hockey programs. If you look at China in the Olympics, they see all these people they trained as gymnasts and say, well, you know what? You'd probably be really good at aerials. You might be good at diving. You might be good at trampoline because you have the strength, you have the flexibility, and a lot of the base skills that can transfer over. So for us, in terms of building these fundamentals, we also look at those motor skills, and the ABCs is what we call them. So agility, balance, coordination, and speed that we can be getting from a lot of different sports. So we're wanting youth to be able to do these different activities here in terms of balancing, walking, running, jumping, swimming, all right, being able to throw, to be able to catch, to be able to have hand-eye coordination. At the same time, and I know it was alluded to earlier, we want them to have fun. We want them to explore, learn creativity through some structured play and through some unstructured play. So it can be some organized sports, But it can also be me playing trampoline dodgeball with my sons because they think it's the best game in the world. All right? It can be exploring, it can be skateboarding, it's hopefully not wiping out like this guy on a bike, but that happens when you are doing different activities. But we need those ABCs in place. We need the athletes in a system, and for Ultimate to succeed, we actually need the other sports to also succeed because they are building athletes that we hope to allure later on and say, you know, soccer is good and fun and all, but have you ever chased a flying disc across a field? So our strategy isn't to encourage participation in those sports, particularly at the earlier stages. It is really hard to teach Ultimate to early ages in elementary school to run an actual game. Can they go play soccer and learn how to run and jump well in that stage? That's for sure. Can they potentially go and have fun learning disc skills playing disc golf? Yeah, they can learn to throw a disc. Can they throw for fun with a parent or in a smaller environment where that's how they're getting success is one-on-one? Definitely. So we're looking at it, both that participation in other sports, programs in Canada like run, jump, throw, as well as how do we incorporate disc skills. So there is a bit of a divide from Ultimate and the other disc sports in Canada. I don't know if it's the same in the United States or not. But at one point, probably my mentors, my coaches, they played everything. They were freestylers, they played DDC, they went disc golfing, they had all these different skills. And one of the things we're starting to look back to is, are some of these other games and activities fun ways for kids to learn disc skills? It may not be Ultimate, but it might be a foundational thing for them to be able to learn and to be able to use so that we can get them throwing discs so that they can learn to catch in different environments. Ultimate isn't the only sport, I'm going to go to the next movie in a second, that is taking this approach. So in the sports community in Canada, in North America, in the world, people are starting to recognize we need to build athletes first. We need to build people who have physical literacy because it benefits all the sports and the sporting community, and it benefits society. So this next movie is from USA Hockey in terms of what they see hockey as being. We're just going to do a minute of it. And that's the most important piece right there, is the disc being thrown is part of hockey. We can stop it there. So for a Canadian where hockey is the sport in the country, it's very gratifying to see Ultimate is being included as part of their programming, as part of building their athletes, and they see throwing a disc as being included. But that is the movement in terms of how do we get better athletes, how do we optimize development, is getting them involved in more sports, getting them involved in unstructured play, getting them having fun. Now there's a question, I think the last one was, but what about the parents? And this is San Francisco, so I'm guessing maybe there's some parents who think they have the next Joe Montana. Maybe there's parents who are convinced in Canada they have the next Wayne Gretzky or Sidney Crosby. And they're convinced they need to put their kid in just the one sport. And that if it's hockey, for instance, they're doing power skating and all of hockey camps throughout the summer. And they are not necessarily doing, can we get the next slides? Seems to be. They seem to be specializing in that sport really early. And the research has been showing that that actually is not beneficial to an athlete's development. There are very few sports that you need to specialize early. And most of those are sports like gymnastics, where there's a certain window for an athlete to develop based on physiological reasons that they're going to need to specialize in that if they want to be a competitive gymnast. There's other cons to doing that as well, socially, developmentally, if you're going to specialize. But for a sport like Ultimate, we are a late specialization sport. There is no reason for an elementary school kid to only play Ultimate, just as there's no reason they only play football, basketball, soccer. there's no reason that they should only be doing hockey. One of my coaches in Winnipeg, Dean Wright, worked at a school that had some of the kids from the Winnipeg Jets, the local hockey team there. And he had talked to one of the parents, Thomas Steen. And his son, he was saying, I'm not putting in hockey camps in the summer at this age. I'm going to go let him have fun. If he wants to go play soccer, I want him to do these other things. I don't want him burning out. I want him to have a passion for it, and when he's playing because he wants to. And I want him to have some time off to recover, to recuperate, and build other skills. His son is Alex Steen, who's one of the best players on the St. Louis Blues now. So it's a philosophy that is being bought into by people who are doing quite well in sport. But the challenge for us has been trying to figure out what are we doing with the parents. How do we convince them? And it may be a little easier with Ultimate. I think the mouse has died. Okay. Yeah, that's all right. Oh, you might have to go again. And again. In terms of looking at when you need to specialize, and it's later and later in terms of how much general training versus sport specific. So we're getting back to that earlier train of thought. In terms of Ultimate, it may be a little easier for us in that we might not have so many parents who thought my kid has to be a star Ultimate player when they're born. Right? We may be starting to get that now, but I have a 6- and a 3-year-old. If they want to be star Ultimate players, great. But for me, understanding athlete development, I'm like, if I push them, it's probably going to result that they're not going to want to play Ultimate, they're not going to enjoy it. Right now, my son, my eldest, he's into climbing, he's into playing disc golf and collecting empties on the side so he can buy monster trucks with it. He's into soccer, swimming, and that's fine. I don't want to push anything in terms of it too early. You got to specialize. Let's practice throwing at that age, because it's not going to result in him being happy, and it's not going to result in terms of his development as a person being optimal. So in terms of our model, we do have recommendations on when to specialize. That's our approach. Is you're looking at later in terms of high school for those top-end athletes. That's when they're going to start thinking about reducing the number of sports that they're really focused on in terms of this idealized model. For where Ultimate's at, that's probably not most athletes right now, because we don't have this whole system coming all the way up from the active start. It's probably going to be a lot of them playing multiple sports too. The gentleman at the start that I showed, Cole Keffer, he played on the World Juniors team for us this year. He also played on the U19 national rugby team. So there's still a lot of players who are benefiting from playing multiple sports, and they're staying engaged and kind of getting a break from the different ones. All right, so the next area we're going to cover, developmental age. Kids are pretty cool. So if anyone here has worked with a lot of younger kids, or they have some pretty cool developmental cycles in terms of how they develop. They also can be kind of crazy sometimes. So maybe they have very poor time management skills at certain ages. But the development is one day you have one kid, and the next, they're totally different. If you look at this photo here, these 3 boys on that side, they're the same age. These 2 girls, they are the same age. Chronologically speaking, they are the same age. Developmentally, they are not at all in terms of how mature they are physically, in terms of puberty, and where they are along that process. So in terms of ultimate and long-term athlete development, we want to make sure that the guy who has the growth spurt first isn't suddenly the star of the team and no one else gets to see the disc. Because that's happened in other sports. In Canada and hockey, they found because the cutoff for the dates was January 1st, kids, January, February, March, were disproportionately making it through to juniors and up to the NHL. Why? They're bigger, faster, stronger. Coaches paid more attention to them. They didn't give the other kids who were later bloomers a chance, or as much touches of the puck, or as much playtime, whatever it was. And so for hockey, they were worried about, we're missing out on a ton of great athletes by doing this. We'll go to the next one. Right? So someone might get a growth spurt early. Suddenly they may be much better at rebounding than everyone else. Or they could have been like me and grown 10 inches in one summer, where I went from the shortest kid in my class to the tallest and suddenly had no coordination. Right? So I ended up in that process as well of being very awkward. And I won my first national championship in the junior division on the bench because I was too awkward and cut my head playing tag that day. So that's one of those things we have to be aware of. How do we deal with the fact that kids who are the same chronological age develop very differently? And competitions, generally speaking, we talk about our national teams, U19, U23, they're age-driven in sport. This is the group. It's not developmentally driven, it's age-driven. So how do we make sure that we're having the best opportunities for all these athletes so they can have positive self-concept, self-esteem, and that they have a perceived competence as they develop in the sport? I've coached middle school for a number of years, and one of the athletes that I had the privilege of coaching is Mark Lloyd. Some of you may have heard of him from Toronto's GOAT, Toronto Rush. He's won the last 2 Canadian Player of the Year awards. When I coached Mark Lloyd in middle school, he would not have been my pick to be the best Canadian player. He was short. He was not very fast. He was probably about average speed. He liked to wear pajama pants to every practice. He didn't always seem to be taking it seriously. But you know what? He had a good forehand. He had some good throws. At that stage of development, he was not the best player. However, later on, he grew. He became taller. And he became a lot faster as his legs got longer. And then he put a ton of time into the sport. If he hadn't had a lot of opportunities in middle school to touch the disc like everyone else, he may not have stayed with the sport. He may not have been the player who kept developing and became one of the champions of the sport for Canada. So for us, around developmental age, our strategy has been looking around playtime guidelines. In those ages in particular, about making sure we figure out everyone's getting a chance still because they are at different developmental stages. Still getting a chance at different positions and playing, because if they've never practiced being a cutter because they were always short, and then one day they are suddenly a tall, deep strike physique, they may not have had that chance to develop. And also being very aware for coaches of understanding kids are at different developmental stages, so you got to be careful in terms of how you're treating them and making sure that everyone is getting an opportunity to develop here. So we're not missing athletes who really could develop and shine. All right, the 5th one, as we go through this whole list, I know it's a little long, is sensitive periods. As I mentioned earlier, kids are pretty cool in that they have periods where they change really rapidly. And this is an area that I've been really fascinated about since working on the LTAD. And it's really around accelerated adaptation. One of these areas that I think most adults could kind of think about is language. Young children often pick up language very quickly. They're in a stage where they have accelerated adaptation to it. Doesn't mean that an adult can't learn a new language. You definitely can, but it's not going to be as easy for you at that stage as it was for the kid in that accelerated window. While it works for stuff like language, it also works for physical attributes, for training of stamina, strength, speed, suppleness, skill, suppleness or flexibility. Oh, is that the wrong one? So this graph kind of shows the different areas in terms of males and females as they get older in terms of developmentally when those windows are. And I'll go into them in a little more detail, but you see that the curve there on each one, that's how fast they grow. It's called the peak height velocity. So as you can see, it spikes around puberty, and that influences when they have this accelerated adaptation and when the different areas can be trained. So earlier on, speed, especially agility, is available, things like suppleness or flexibility, and later on, strength and another speed window are coming in. All right, so stamina is around that onset of PHV. Strength is afterwards, so you wouldn't want to be doing a lot of strength training outside of against your own body weight in terms of afterwards. Speed, there's 2 different windows like I had mentioned, one earlier, one later. Flexibility, 6 to 10, and you need to pay attention during that period of the growth spurt because you'll get the kids like me who are not very coordinated and their flexibility went off. However, if like this woman, you keep up your flexibility training, you can maintain a lot of flexibility, but it becomes harder with age to be able to become more flexible. And same thing with speed. There's a cap at a certain point where it starts to be hard to build a new speed. Now this is the cool one for Ultimate, and the big change that we're focusing on is this skill window. It's 8 to 12. Kids have a huge opportunity to learn new skills. It also declines with age at a certain point. So in terms of your ability to try and learn a completely new sport that you have no transfer skills in, it can be pretty hard. If I'd never played baseball before and I wanted to start playing baseball in terms of hitting a ball and I didn't do anything that involved hand-eye coordination, it would be a hard transfer. However, if I had played some racket sports, it might be a little easier because I have a skill that's going to transfer. Same thing in terms of just general motions, formation of these basic ABCs again. In sports movement, it's going to be easier for me to transfer to different sports. Now with that skill window, it's an area, in Canada at least, we don't have a lot of programs for. And we want to start focusing on this skill window and really get kids with discs in their hands building skills so that they become better throwers and they build those building blocks for the sport at that age. And we want to figure out the ways that we're, one, making sure it's fun for them, but two, getting lots and lots and lots of touches. So smaller field sizes, playing 4-on-4, playing 5-on-5, playing games, whether it's keep away, whether it's a hot box game, or whether it's you're trying to score in a small field ultimate, but keeping it fun and keeping the disc in their hands so that they are getting lots of repetitions and lots of opportunity to improve. So this is an area that we have adjusted rules, and we've realized it's not just in this stage, but in other stages, we need to focus more on skills. We need to make sure that we're making skills fun and adjusting rules so that they are appropriate for development. In middle school, our recommendation is not to have zone. We want to have kids learning to throw the disc, and to be honest, most middle school teams that are new have zero chance against a zone. There's going to be one kid, maybe two, touch the disc, and it's not going to be fun for them. And they're not going to build the skills. The team that is zoning is going to get a quick turnover and then score. But we'd rather both teams are working on their throwing and catching and getting more kids included. So that was one of the changes that we were making there. All right, holistic approach. I think the last presentation really went into that about coaching and talking about building the athlete. We want to put the athlete first, and as part of any developmental model, you want to be developing the whole athlete. You want to be building character and ethics. You want to be building a person. So lifestyle starts coming in: physical, technical, tactical, mental, cognitive, emotional growth. And for us, in our recommendations, we look at each stage. What are our recommendations for addressing these different areas of the athlete in their development? How do we go beyond just the physical and make sure we're including consideration for life-work balance or school? How do we, the emotional side of things in terms of life? How do we include spirit of the game and character development? And that's a huge opportunity, again, for our sport to have spirit included and to have different ways of introducing spirit for different ages. Our Spirit of the Game Committee has recently come up with a resource we're giving out to our coaches about children and spirit of the game, and talking about how, you know what, kids instinctively get spirit. They really do. If you want to talk to a 7-year-old about conflict resolution, they may not understand those words at all, but you want to talk about fairness, following the rules, working things out with their peers, they get all those base components. They make up their own games all the time on the playground. These are the rules. We made them up. This is how you follow them. They're going to call each other out if they're not. Sounds a lot like Ultimate. All right? So they do that already. And it's just really figuring out how to keep developing that and holding on to it and changing the language as they get older in terms of how they would address it and how they would approach the topics. These last few items are areas that we definitely have a lot of work to do on. So periodization, in terms of how do you sequence training and growth into logical, scientifically based schedules of optimal performance preparation. This is an area for us working with Sport Canada in terms of trying to get Sport Canada funding has been very challenging. It's an area that we don't have a lot of resources that are academic in terms of to the level that other sports have developed, in terms of what the different cycles you're going to have, how much preparation time, how are you going to try and peak? I think a lot of the club teams are getting a lot better about that in the last 5-10 years and are spending a lot of focus on those terms in terms of peaking and trying to taper their training and make it all work, and periodizing to make sure that the amount of competition is appropriate. But it's a very complicated area, and it's one that we're going to keep working on in terms of our research and figuring out how to implement. So here's a bunch of those different factors that go into performance. There are a bunch of the factors that are from that holistic view, but that in terms of planning for periodizing to get your peak performance, you got to make sure all these gears are turning the right way. If some of them are stuck or aren't going the right way, you're not going to get that peak performance. You could go 2. All right, competition. Does the athlete have enough time to develop, or does the coach have enough time to develop the athlete? System of competition favor the athlete's development. Can you develop talent when you compete more than you train? This is an issue that a lot of youth sport in Canada had, was parents love games. Kids like playing, they like going to the game too. But if you're in that 8 to 12 skill window and you're not actually working on skills and you have 2 games and 1 practice, you don't have time to work on those foundational elements. And what they were finding was that it's not working for those kids to just be playing game, because they don't have the time to come back and build a skill to go to that next game. So in Canada, in terms of the general thing from Sport Canada, the recommendation are different ratios for different ages. This is the standard 7 stages instead of 8 here, but they're looking at how much training versus competition. And at the younger ages, it's a lot more training than competition, in that they need to build the skills. It doesn't mean you can't build skills in a fun way, in that there might be a game, but it's not mimicking the competition that you are necessarily looking at, and that you need them to build those skills initially. As you get to the top stages, you want more competition, and you want more activities that are like competition. So whether it's practice and putting game situations in place, and a lot more of that approach, as athletes progress, it moves more and more towards that end. But early on, we have to hit that skill window. We have to focus on the basic skills. So our recommendations and what we're looking at is, in this area are the stage-specific ratios and following them. So making sure that if you're running a program, you have a certain number of practices to the game ratio. That if you're only doing practices, that you try and incorporate it in a similar way as well. We're also reviewing our competition format, which is a huge undertaking and very difficult. So ultimate players can be extremely generous and extremely cheap at the same time. You ask them to support you to go a tournament and buy a disc for 15, 20 bucks, they'll do it. You ask them for a donation, they'll do it. They only get 5, 6 games at a tournament, they're going to complain to the TD about the value of how much they spent at that tournament, right? So there is a bit of a challenge, I think, for us in terms of our community and what we were used to, and the amount of travel time. A lot of youth sports don't play many games. A lot of adult sports don't play many games at a tournament. I know USAU, in terms of the club championships, has moved more and more in that direction in terms of fewer games. But for us in Canada, with our geography and the cost to travel, it's a huge challenge in terms of figuring out how do we make the competitions work. How do we make it so that the number of games in a tournament makes sense for the different age groups while still recognizing the amount of cost and effort going into this? And this may be their only development opportunity for a community that's far away to get to play other teams of a similar caliber. When we look at our competition, how do we make sure that our calendar for those top teams is appropriate? There are so many more opportunities to play Ultimate now than there were a decade or 2 ago at every level. So in terms of the top club teams, do they have too many different commitments? Do some of those players who play college don't have an off-season, don't have a time to prehabilitate and rehabilitate between? When we're looking at it for those players in terms of Worlds, and then they play Canadian Series, and then they play the US Series in the fall if they're good enough, and then they decide maybe we'll go to Pan Ams in November after that. And we want to play the indoor season that we have as well. How do I figure out what's the right competition review? There's so much and there's so many opportunities. And figuring out what's right for the athletes and for their development And you know, to some extent, it's probably also going to be their pocketbook, because it does get expensive to be participating in all of these different opportunities. System harmony. So I like this picture because everyone has some baggage. And I think it illustrates it well. If we see this truck as being our athlete, and they're needing a lot of different input and a lot of people working to get them to the top, we have to realize that we do have our baggage and we do have our interests. Parents have different interests, volunteers, coaches, and the athlete themselves, right? Their teammates. And if we want them to be able to achieve that optimal path, we have to work really hard together to make sure that everyone can get on board. We have to really work hard to make sure that we're aligned and between administrators, coaches, officials, parents, and athletes, and we're on the same page. So in Canada, we have schools, community centers, and high-performance clubs. I think it's probably similar here, where athletes might be in all these different ones, and figuring out how do they work together in a system, which athletes are going where, and how does that all flow. Because it is all interdependent. And for long-term athlete development to work, the different levels and the different groups need to all work together in harmony for it to be effective. In Canada, one of the things that we developed was a player and coach development model, or PDM and CDM. And we've looked at how do we incorporate our coaches into the different areas. The coaching structure in Canada is a little different than the US in that we have a national overseeing body, the Coaching Association of Canada, that oversees all the sports. And they divide it into community and competition. So if you wanted to be a community coach, introducing kids to the sport primarily, up to about middle school, you would take one type of training. If you want to be a competition coach, you don't need to take any of that community training because it's a very different approach that you're taking. It's a very different type of coaching that you're doing, and vice versa. You can, but our senior national team coach doesn't need to necessarily know how to work well with an 8-year-old and their parents. It's just not the same skill set, and they may not be good at it, but they might be great with the senior athletes. So looking at how do we make sure that people know in our system what they should be taking for the different levels is one of the ways that we've approached it. Our community coach program basically covers that whole area, and for us, we've just finished our competition introduction program. It's basically a course on that coaching, and then afterwards, to become a certified coach, an evaluator comes out to watch you coach, to see that you're showing the skills that you went and were trained for. So yeah, again, coaches, very vital in terms of making sure that system harmony works, making sure the training is correct, and that they understand the long-term athlete development. Additionally for us, our LTAD in terms of the different areas, we talk about the roles of administrators at each stage, about parents at each stage, about coaches, so that there are some rules and guidelines for them to understand how to work in harmony. This is another area that we're going to continue developing resources to keep getting better at. Kaizen. So this is continual development or continuous improvement. The idea that we need to always get better and that what we have, this is a living document, the LTAD, but we want to keep improving it. We need research around implementation. Devil is always in the details. And you know what? Ultimate hasn't been around long enough for us to know what is the best thing to do at all these different stages. So that's an area that we're continuing to work on with pilot projects. This is one that's been successful for us in Ottawa. It's I Love to Play Ultimate. It's basically started with 4 inner-city community clubs that ran and partnered with the City of Ottawa to teach Ultimate and run a 4-week program. They had such great response that they opened it up to 2 more to 6 clubs the next year. And then they also added a week. And then they brought in a sponsor, Canadian Tire, which is a big company in Canada, that will be paying for it going forward next year. So it's one of those things where that was great to kind of get this developed. What was even better for us is they trialed a bunch of our materials that were like, let's try this game and see how this works at this age group, because we don't have a ton of experience at it. We really want to build skills in that skill window, but there aren't a lot of programs that currently do it. So we got feedback from the coaches on the kids love this activity, or this one worked well, or they can't do this one for more than a minute. So it was good to get that kind of an idea of what was working and to try and build those resources for the community. So in summary, long-term athlete development is looking at building an athlete, the optimal athlete, and what their path would be. You start in with physical literacy and trying to build that at the early stages. Try and cash in on those windows of trainability like skill, speed, stamina, strength, and flexibility. You're looking to improve your talent ID and trying to have more players able to develop. You want to improve the system of competition so it works for the athletes. Align the system and have cohesion. And you need really good coaches. So I'm very glad you're all here today, those of you that are coaches in particular. We need good administrators too, but having good coaches is crucial for them to understand the needs of the athlete. Because without good athletes, it's really hard, or without good coaches, it's really hard to put the health and well-being of the athletes first. And having coaches that take an interest beyond just the field really shows that dedication to try and make sure that these needs will be taken care of. That's my presentation, so thank you all very much. You can leave it from there.
We won't take maybe, because we're going to work.
Yeah, I can answer a couple of questions, and the workshop we can structure around a little. It's okay either way.
Thanks, Danny. Can you explain a little bit about your coaching delivery methods? Like, are they online workshops? Are they full-day workshops? What have you found works the best in Canada?
So for our community stream, it's basically a one-day workshop, and it is one that is in person. For the competition one, it's a little complicated. So basically, we got out of teaching planning practice, we got out of teaching making ethical decisions, and we got out of teaching nutrition and let the Coaching Association of Canada teach these because they want them taught in a specific way. You can do those remotely, you can do those in a class, it's up to the coach. Partly because we wanted our course to be a certain length, and if we included those, it would be longer, and partly because then our learning facilitators, who are our coach instructors, could just teach what they're passionate about, which was the ultimate specific elements. We integrate a little bit of extra making ethical decisions as it relates to spirit in our course, but it is distinct from that one. So that course they would take in person. The evaluation part you can do remotely. So we have a test in terms of rules knowledge, a test with questions around spirit of the game. You have to submit your practice plan, and then you also, if you're doing it remotely, you have to submit a videotape of you running that practice. The evaluation does have a grid as well. It kind of lists this is what we're looking for. Just like the earlier speaker talked about, meeting with parents and letting them know the expectations ahead of time. We're not trying to fail anyone. We want everyone to pass the evaluation. So we're saying this is what you're graded on, so make sure that you're incorporating this in how you coach. We want you to be a better coach, and if you're practicing while being evaluated, you have a better chance of it.
So those same coaches are going through basically for the nutrition and planning practices, they do that through a Coaching Canada?
That's correct.
Okay, and that's online?
It can be online, or you can go to a class. Some people prefer the class, but if you're in a community that's hard to get to or your schedule is tough, you can do the online.
I'm just trying to understand, Danny, did you guys have to sort of integrate with Sport Canada's long-term athlete development and the coaching stuff to be sort of aligned with everything that's going on in Canada?
That's correct. So as I talked about at the start, it's really looking at the sports supporting each other and building a system to build more athletes, build a bigger pool. And for us in Canada, a lot of it to try and chase funding from the federal government and to try and be recognized by the correct groups, you have to have certain elements. So our coaching, we need to have certain modules to be they call National Coaching Certification Program, which then all the schools, all the parents, they recognize. They're like, okay, this is like a real program, this has a special stamp on it or whatever in their view. Same thing for long-term athlete development. Most of these stats and the research in here, I didn't do. I'm not an academic in that sense, in terms of sport, in terms of all the research, 10-year rules, things of that nature. They provided the templates and a lot of the general areas for long-term athlete development and had each sport figure out what are the pieces they need to be successful and to tailor it to their own sport.
I've talked to you on the phone about this. I think it might have been a year and a half ago now, but one of the things that I found most interesting was you talking about how a middle school game played on a full-size field might end up only being played 6-9 as the final score, and then decreasing 10 yards off of that field got you to that 15. Can you talk about any of that kind of research? And just, I thought that was super interesting, and I wanted to make sure everybody had a chance to hear that.
Sure. My hometown, Winnipeg, Manitoba, I'm sure you all know where that is located in the middle of Canada in the prairies, about 8 hours north of Minneapolis. The guys from Wisconsin might actually know where it is. And it basically has a tournament in October called Hold Back the Snow. And for those in California, it really lives up to its name. So it could snow. I think it snowed about a quarter of the time. And that tournament we've used to pilot a few different changes. And one of those changes was at the middle school level, shortening the fields. It gets windy on the prairies because we don't have many trees, and the trees we have are short. And so with the wind and the different conditions, they found that once you shortened it, a lot of games were now getting finished. And I don't remember the exact dimensions off the top of my head, but it wasn't huge. It was only like 10, 15 yards, but it just made it that much easier at that level for them to be able to score. And that small change, they also found then later on, at booking fields, they could get now regulation fields in more spots. And different things of that nature that kind of helped the middle school program, and they've stuck with it as it's been a good adjustment for them. What was that?